Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day three of AP's Press Freedom Week. My name is Mark Grant, and I serve as the Vice President of Global Safety, Risk and Resilience here at the AP. Today, we're talking about something that affects not just journalists, but anyone who follows the news closely. We're talking about mental health and how you stay informed and grounded when the news feels relentless. This week, AP is hosting 5 days of conversations around press freedom, independent journalism, and what it takes to report the facts in the modern landscape. Today's session is designed for everyone, journalists and news readers alike. Very pleased to be joined by a wonderful group of experts who I've got the pleasure of working with on a day-to-day basis. We've got Lyndall Herman, AP's America's Director for Global Safety, Risk and Resilience. We've got Destiny Montague, who's AP's Director of Cybersecurity, and we're joined by Harry Keys from CIC Wellbeing, the provider of AP's Employee Assistance Programme, Trauma Support Services, and he's helped us develop our first AP peer-to-peer network. Before we begin, everything we do at AP, including investing in safety and wellbeing of our journalists, is made possible in part by the support of readers and donors like you. If you've enjoyed the Press Freedom Week and learning about the work AP does, please consider making a gift and donate at apnews.com/donate or by scanning the QR code that's just been put in the chat. Right, since this week is about press freedom, I want to ground these conversations in what journalists are dealing with right now through the lens as the people supporting them, particularly in environments where press freedom is under pressure. So let's dive right in, and I'd love to start with you, Lyndall. What are the most common psychological pressures journalists are facing right now, especially in high intensity or restricted environments?
Thanks, Mark. I think this is such a great question, and I'd love to sort of highlight two pieces here. I think the first one is a sense that they have to power through as things are happening, so that they can't just stop and process something as it happens, but there's constantly more breaking news, and so it's just continuing one after the other into each of the different stories that they're facing. I think a lot of it too is then augmented between the stories that they're covering, the situations and contexts that they're in, and the online harassment and abuse that they're facing. So that this is not just something that ends when the story ends, but it shows up every single day in your inbox and the emails that you get. It shows up online in social media with the comments that are being left, and the ways in which the general public are engaging them. Sometimes it's really complimentary. Much more often, unfortunately, it's quite negative. There's a lot of misogynistic, racist, and hate-filled speech directed not just towards the stories, but towards them as individuals. And that makes it increasingly difficult to kind of show up in that space and be positive and continue to engage. I think another big thing that I see happening is this idea that, someone else has it worse. So there's always one team that's dealing with something more difficult. There's, one team wherever they might be geographically located where things are more difficult. And I think it's really important when we talk about mental health and well-being and resilience that it's not a comparative experience. That where you are is where you are, and that's what we need to be talking about. Not that someone else is maybe experiencing something else more difficult. And so I think those are kind of the biggest day-to-day pieces that I see coming up in the teams that we work with.
Great, great, Lyndall. Harry, building on that point, how do factors such as hostile environments, restricted press freedom, or sustained exposure to difficult news affect psychological safety over time?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think I want to build on really what Lyndall said as well about that expanding definition of what a hostile environment is and how easy it is to find ourselves in this space where we're comparing ourselves to others and their experience. A hostile environment for journalists with the advent of online hate and harassment is anywhere they are. It's not just war zones and authoritarian states that people are working in, it's the newsrooms where those images are coming back to. So the first of all is just an overall culture of like an erosion of psychological safety. If you know the environment you're in as a as a psychological being, as an animal, if you know that there's more threat and there's more danger around, you're already operating at a higher level of pressure and therefore perhaps a higher level of stress than you usually do. And we all know that when we reach those limits of stress for ourselves, all sorts of stuff changes. Our capacity, our accuracy, and things like that will be impacted. We might start seeing people being hypervigilant more as a norm. We don't tend to see this actually coming out in the work or in the newsroom. This is actually what tends to have the longer term effects on our relationships in our personal life, actually, where journalists have this amazing ethic to be able to carry on going, to be able to extend their working days when a big event happens. I mean, we all saw over the weekend a big event happening surrounded by journalists who immediately go into work mode and don't even think about that. So actually, the biggest impact is just finding space to recover from those particular events that are picked up along the way. We might see a kind of narrowing of decision making when we're in that hypervigilant state as well. So we feel less power, less control, less choice. And of course, if it's happening everywhere all the time to all of you, we get that normalization of distress and burnout. So it actually becomes really difficult for someone to put their hands up. And where I tend to link this to press freedom is it's just removing really important voices from the press. If more people are burning out, it's making, as Lyndall said, certain groups of people who are more targeted by some of those attacks, feeling less like news is a place for them. So we're removing those marginalized voices already. So it has a lot of effects, a lot of impacts. And what I'm consistently amazed by, Mark, is the resilience that everyone I work with across the sector shows.
Yeah, that's some great points there, Harry. I want to zoom in a little bit further at that. We've spoke about creating space and other things we can do to support our journalists who are constantly under pressure. But what other tools do we have in our arsenal to protect journalists, and how do you all work together to ensure the support is there when our people need it the most? That's to all the panel. We'll start with Destiny. Let's jump in with you first. Let's hear.
Sure. Yeah, we try to work together closely and often. AP has an internal task force between the cybersecurity team and the global safety risk and resilience team that handles online abuse, harassment, digital threats. That was born from the ever-increasing risks and abuse faced by journalists. We wanted a way to provide fast and practical support and guidance. So between us, we've got expertise across physical, digital, psychological safety. So our support can really be anything from doing risk assessments to monitoring for escalations, to some of the more technical controls, including, digital security, online best practices, and things like that. So, for example, if a journalist receives an abusive message and they let us know, we can take measures to perhaps block the sender. We do that in a way that is silent to the sender, so that they're not alerted, they don't get a bounce back or anything like that. Or sometimes it helps if we continue to monitor the situation. And in that case, we can redirect the sender's messages to an internal monitored inbox, which allows us to keep an eye on things, but then, takes the immediate stress and the burden off of the journalist.
Great, thanks, Destiny. If I could pass that to you, Lyndall, I know you work very closely with Destiny on a day-to-day basis, but from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is, we try to approach this systemically, so that there's consistency across how we're reaching out to journalists and how they're able to access these services. So as Destiny said, like that's a very multi kind of pronged approach that we take between the various teams, bringing in CIC, our peer support network, other sort of psychosocial services that might be useful in this context, depending on the content or the type of harassment or abuse that is is being received, but also just the cumulative impact, and making sure that there are spaces for staff to kind of engage and find support there. I think the other piece to this is that it's a really human-centric approach. And so the fact that, Destiny and I will do sessions in the newsroom, that we're just a Zoom or cell phone call away from staff so that they know that they can reach out if it's something they even just want to talk through, that it's not, just a faceless inbox that things are going to when they report, but that they can actually reach out and have a conversation with a person that might just be, I need empathy in this moment, of knowing that someone is listening and understanding what I'm going through, or we need to now shift into problem solving mode. And how can we move through these processes that we have and make sure that we are taking steps that, might be necessary depending on how we've rated the risk associated with the threats that are coming through.
So it sounds like from an AP perspective, engagement with the journalist is key here. From your position, Harry, as an external partner, you work with a lot of news organisations across the world. So what tools do other organisations have in their arsenal, and how have you seen it evolve over time?
Thank you. The tools are really important. You kind of listed how we work together at the start of this. I think Stephanie's put a bit of an overview about it in the chat, but having choice is empowerment. That gives the journalist options of where they can go. Those options being visible, like Destiny and Lyndall both talked about, is absolutely vital. But I mean, at basic, it's confidential psychological support that's specialized to journalists. I think we've recognized the specific impacts on journalists from the work that they do, even in the first 10 or so minutes of this. So it needs clinicians that understand that context. I think also understand the busyness of the roles that people are working in the sector as well. So you're not going to get 12 sessions at 4 p.m. on a Thursday with a correspondent that they can meet. So we have to be flexible to that. I think that's why peer-to-peer support is so powerful amongst journalists, because that shared context is already there. And if you can create, as we do with our customers, these kind of confidential spaces that allow that to occur within the workplace, that can be really useful. But overarching all of that, it's exactly what Destiny and Lyndall both just talked about. It's turning the same attention you give to the world for the news you're reporting on back in on yourselves, and looking at it in a multifaceted way, having these things set up where all types of safety, physical, online, and psychological, are worked on together, because then I, as a member of staff for that organization, feel safe there. As long as you are all talking about the great work that you do as well as you do, and I know that's hard in your very busy jobs as well, but most of that is kind of where we see the impact on organizational culture. And that tends to be the biggest driver of journalists feeling safe and feeling able to do their job, is what's the culture here? Am I respected? Am I able to step away from my work for 10 minutes to speak to a peer? Do I feel empowered by my editor to have a debrief with CIC after a difficult assignment? Or do I feel like it's going to be something I'm going to be punished for or looked at negatively on? Because trust me, the journalists are already doing that themselves. If they ever feel they need support from any one of us, be it physical, online, or psychological, they're already interpreting that as some failure in them. So we have to kind of, be a bit louder about that. And that close collaboration that we have as clinicians with you as an organization and many of our other customers has really helped us to understand that and drive that cultural change.
Great, Harry. Just building on that point very quickly, do you want to give an overview of what a peer-to-peer program is? There may be a lot of people on the call who have not heard that term before.
Yeah, absolutely. In the organization that you're in, everyone that's a colleague of yours is a peer. There might be some power imbalances, some different levels of seniority and differences in skills, but what you have is a very important shared context of the work you do and the way in which you do it. So a peer support network comes into that, first of all, and learns how that structure works and how it fits together. And then what we do at CIC is we help an organization identify individuals, usually through some sort of expression of interest or an application process. We'll do a clinical interview with them to make sure they're appropriate for the role, a full training course. In fact, we've got another cohort in a couple of weeks. I look forward to seeing some of you in person then. And then continued specialist psychological support from us at CIC afterwards. So having kind of supervision sessions like you would with clinicians, meeting with the peers. And what that allows you to do as an organization is then go out with internal comms saying, here is a place where you can go when you're right in the heat of the moment of things, or just when things feel that they're dying down, you've got a gap, and you can take that 15 or so minutes, speak with a colleague, and then that colleague, if they're really, well suited and well informed, they can say, hey, I'd really like you to talk to Destiny about this. Can I put you in touch? Because remember, the time in which that person is struggling, they don't know where to turn. So you just want that lowest bar of access possible. And we find that's what a peer network is, and has some really transformative results on that organizational culture I was talking about earlier.
Great, Harry, thank you. I'm going to pivot slightly because the impact extends beyond journalism professionals. So it's maybe worth discussing on how ongoing exposure to distressing news might influence the wider informed public. So, Linda, let's start with you again on this one. When you experience distressing content, what does a good immediate response look like?
I think this is actually a little bit the same, whether you're a journalist or a non-journalist experiencing distressing content. And I think what's really important is to realize, that while this may have become day to day, it is still not normal. And recognizing that, this is not something that you have to accept as kind of a space that you're living in or working in, and just acknowledging that this is outside of the norm is a really important baseline to start with. And so it's okay to find it distressing, that this is not what you expect on a day to day, and that it's fine to take a minute, that you don't have to power through this, and that you have to think about what's going to set you up for success, and kind of finding space to recalibrate and be able to come back and more meaningfully continue to engage with the news. And so I think that's where it becomes really important to have your spaces, your communities, your people that you can go to, where when you do experience distressing news coverage that you might be engaging with, to say, all right, I'm going to step back for a minute. I'm going to go and have a conversation. I'm going to, pet my dog. I'm going to take a 10-minute walk and take myself outside of this space so that I can kind of recalibrate my systems, and then exert control over when you're coming back to and engaging with that material. I think it's also important to appreciate that we all process things differently. And so while you might experience something distressing, it might not hit you in that immediate moment that you're watching or engaging with it in an online space, that this is actually distressing to you, that it could come up, a couple days later, a few hours later, and that you might find yourself exhibiting some of those symptoms that Harry was talking about earlier, irritability, when there's not really a reason for it, that you're more reactive, that something frustrates you a lot more quickly, and that could actually be you processing what you maybe experienced a day or more before, and it's just that your brain has now had time to process that. So it's learning what that processing timeline looks like for you, and what some of those symptoms are, how you might express or experience your reaction to that distress, so that again you can kind of take a step back and say, how can I kind of manage this? How can I, stop engaging with what is maybe provoking that distress, and reset myself so that I'm able to come back and more fully and beneficially engage with it in the long run.
Thank you, Linda. Harry, when that happens and people find themselves in point of crisis, what are one or two coping strategies that CIC encourage in those high-pressured crisis moments?
Yeah, wonderful. And we're all exposed to this, right? We're all susceptible to it. I think one of the things that really helps with this is first of all some recognition of what's going on. I think Lyndall's given some really good insights into kind of how it impacts us. I think it's important to remember that we might badge it as distressing news or distressing content, but for our brain and our body, it's just a distressing experience. It doesn't know that this is content on a screen. My brain doesn't know the difference between that and something happening right next to me functionally. So it's reacting as if I'm in that situation that I'm reading about or watching about on the news or something like that. So yes, kind of as Lyndall said, stepping away, taking a grounding kind of process, breathing for a moment, counting those breaths. I always love to have in my back pocket one or two of these that I know can work for me. They're not going to work every time, but it's something I can do. Because the reason that I'm having that distress response is because I'm put in this position of powerlessness. I'm subject to this experience. It's happening in front of me and I'm watching it as a bystander. And so we will act out in this powerless way of feeling scared by it, feeling angry at it, feeling saddened by it. But actually, when we can step away from it, we kind of engage our brain a bit more in our power response, our control response, rather than that, I guess, vulnerability that we might have been accessing it in. So, yes, grounding processes, breathing, anything to do with our bodies really nice. But one of the most powerful things is, and every journalist I work with hates me saying this, close the laptop and walk away for 5 seconds. You're definitely due a tea break or a coffee break, no matter what sector you work in, by the way. We're all working at incredibly high workload rates these days. You're definitely due 5 minutes away from your desk. Finding that time at the time that you need it the most is a really good re-engagement of that power.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, I think no one regrets a 5 minute air break, do they? Yeah.
Never.
We'll shift slightly again to something that is increasingly shaping the journalist experience and the overall sense of safety, which is online abuse and digital risk. Now, Destiny, you've already alluded to some of this, but I'd love to bring you in here for two specific questions. The first one is, what does online abuse look like today, and how has it evolved over time? And when it does happen, what does effective support look like in practice?
Yeah, I think online abuse today is really less about some of the more obvious spam of the olden days, and I'll date myself by saying, I was around when AOL first came out, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the famous Nigerian prince scam. Emails full of spelling errors and telltale signs that we're all aware of, and we know to look out for these things now. But things are leaning a lot more now towards targeted and really credible seeming social engineering and manipulation tactics. So, that shows up as impersonation of trusted individuals or brands or even people that you work with. And increasingly sophisticated deepfakes, which then are used for fraud or disinformation. It can cause reputational damage and things like that. And then, what's changed with the rise of AI, of course, is just the scale and speed and the realism of these tactics. So, attackers these days can now generate with very little effort very convincing messages, voices, images, videos with really, really minimal effort. So that makes it a lot harder to detect. And even the most careful people out there can fall for these techniques. We're also seeing evolution towards multi-stage or multi-channel attacks where, email and messaging apps and social media and even phone calls are kind of all combined in some form to build trust and credibility over time as part of these social engineering tactics. So overall, I think abuse is becoming more persistent, more coordinated, and definitely more psychologically tailored to each target.
Thanks, Destiny. And building on that further, Lyndall, how has this online abuse, threats, and the targeting of journalists impacted press freedom over the last few years? And what can journalists do to sort of reduce the impact?
Yeah, I mean, hugely, Mark, because in this increasingly interconnected world, it's not just themselves that journalists worry about. It's also their families, it's their friends, it's their circle. If you are living in an online space, you have any kind of social media, there's pictures of you out there enjoying your life, because that's what we use social media for initially. it was a much different, sort of more innocent and naive place where we were perhaps comfortable posting pictures of a backyard barbecue that we were hosting, or attending, one of our children's school plays, or anything like that. And, all of the fantastic journalist techniques that we are able to use to conduct investigative journalism, open source investigations, using reverse image searches, figuring out geolocations from shadows and things like that, are also unfortunately tools that are then used against our journalists. And so a lot of this then has a deeper running impact of, what can I safely speak about, knowing what is available online about me, and how might bad faith actors try to access that and then use it against me and my family. So it's a massive amount of educational work with our journalists. That's a lot of what Destiny and I do, is how to make yourself a more difficult target. So it's sitting down and looking at the spaces that you inhabit, what you're comfortable sharing, and what that can expose about you, and how we can modify that so you can still have a genuine engagement and relationship with the communities that you write for and are part of, without otherwise exposing yourself in ways that might make you or your family feel unsafe. And that, in turn, helps to promote a little bit more journalistic freedom, where our journalists feel safe covering topics because they know that they and their families are not going to be targeted. We're lucky that we have a team to do this. That's not the case in every newsroom. It's not the case, certainly in every country where we work either, where there are different laws in place that allow different kind of activities and different approaches to trying to engage with journalists around this material. And so it does look different, right? It's also a constantly evolving landscape. And so it means that we really have to adapt. And something that was working one week might not be working the next. And that might alter the types of stories that our journalists feel comfortable covering as well.
Great, Lyndall. And Harry, I'm going to come to you now with and talk about stigma. It is something which, in the journalist community, but also outside of journalism, people are often not comfortable raising their hand when they are at breaking point or crisis point. Can you just give a bit of an overview of how that has evolved and talk about the body of work that's been done to reduce the stigma within newsrooms?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I don't see people around me putting their hand up and saying it's okay to struggle or it's okay to be impacted like this, how am I going to do it myself? That's usually what kind of stigma is and talks about. We don't, thankfully, have so much stigma where people are being explicit and saying, I don't believe in psychological safety. I don't believe you need your mental health looked after. But what actually I need is that to be explicit, that you do care about it. So the best work that's done is the engagement that we can have at a senior level in organizations, where we can get that message to start as high up as possible and filter down that it's okay to take this break. I sit here advocating for people to step away from their desks at a time where, people are feeling their roles are tenuous in the world, again, no matter what sector we're working in. So it can kind of feel kind of counterintuitive. A lot of the tips that we have are about not doing the thing that's hurting you, yet you might feel forced to stay in front of that thing that's hurting you. So we can get that senior level messaging, if we can get that organizational culture around the fact that this is important, and that comes down to all of us and the actions that we do, but more so lays on the shoulders of senior individuals. And there are small things that most organizations can do that they're not, maximizing the use of EAPs. Most organizations out there have an EAP program that staff are not aware of, they're not using enough, and the organization isn't going to that EAP and driving them and saying, hey, this is what we need, this is what we're recognizing. So I'd always encourage more of that engagement as well. And when we're talking more specifically about things like online abuse and digital risk and things like that, I think it's really important that we have a culture that takes that seriously, where people are believed. Because my first instinct is going to be to compare my experience to others. And if it's something more new, like online abuse and harassment, I may never have seen a colleague talk about that. So I am learning the language. I'm doing it for the first time ever, in my opinion. And of course, I'm going to fear the worst. I'm going to fear if I'm doing something new, being dismissed, not being believed. Someone saying, well, that's not as bad as the abuse Harry gets, so we're just going to ignore you and move on. We, of course, fear these things because it's new to us. So getting those senior level engagements, getting people to speak openly about how important managing these risks are and providing support for when we're impacted by them is that drives people to take support at an earlier stage, which I guess comes back to my earlier thoughts around kind of people burning out. Is actually if I can get support the first time I receive this kind of response, or the first time my relationship to press freedom is impacted, then I'm much more likely to be able to get that support on a longer basis and not have that deteriorating effect.
Thank you, Harry. We've talked about the pressures, whether from the news itself, the operating environment, which is constantly changing, or online threats. It'd be good to turn and talk about what helps people manage sustainably, especially because the current flow of news is not slowing down. I'm going to bring you back in, Harry, and when people say the news is getting too much, what
Yeah.
is happening psychologically at that moment?
Well, I'll start off a bit with my previous answer, where we are being exposed to a distressing experience when we're watching the news. It's very rarely the news wraps up or even make it to the end, and I see that nice story about a garden party or a kid's play or whatever it is. I think I spoke to one of your colleagues a few weeks ago that was covering, blossoming trees somewhere. Lovely, but very rare. So, first of all, if it's getting too much, why am I not stepping away from it? Why do I feel forced to get more of it, even when I feel like it's too much? And that's the bit where I find it the most interesting. When we're talking about news, we're talking about our awareness of the vulnerability in the world, the stresses in the world that we like to be aware of. So we can feel this guilt around switching off that kind of keeps us in there. We can feel, I must bear witness to this. And of course, journalists have that strength of wanting to bear witness, but that bleeds into us, into your communities, into your audiences. We feel like, because you're taking this so seriously, how dare I look away? Especially if I'm someone who lives in a safe and comfortable environment. I feel like I have no right to step away from it. We can also see, and we use the phrase kind of doom scrolling. The kind of the psychological term would be fear-driven overconsumption, right? Actually, there's danger out there, and I need to keep an eye on it. So I must stay on top of it all of the time. So both of those are based in stress. Both that guilt and that fear are based in the stress that I'm feeling personally in my life. I might be trying to compare it to others and trying to find this context, but it's my stress. So I really think it's important that people recognize that one of the responses to stress is an uncontrolled emotional response. We all know this because we shout at our loved ones, we take it out on the bus driver, whatever it might be. The people that deserve it the least get the kind of brunt of our impact here. So the fear and the guilt are that uncontrolled emotional response turned inwards, and me going, I'm not good enough to step away from this, or I'm not strong enough to not be aware of what's going on. So if we can deal with stress in any way, we can minimize those impacts, minimize the nervous system overload, minimize that loss of perspective and that emotional capacity for ourselves. So like many people, you're going to hate how simple my advice is, but self-care, giving yourself what you need, resting well, exercising, all of those will have an impact on these kind of activities about not being able to step away when things feel too much.
Yeah, I also think you often forget that there's more to news than politics and conflict. I'm a big advocate of the joy, wonder, and discovery. I'm not sure if you've seen that article last week about the
I
robotic
did, yeah.
arm beating people at ping pong. That just helps me reset for the day. So I think there's tools that people can use and develop themselves. Linda, talking about tools and habits, what habits or routines make the biggest difference in
Mm.
building resilience over time?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think the most important piece here is the ones that you can stick with and maintain, right? And so that sounds simple, but really, it doesn't have to be the perfect routine or the perfect habit. It has to be one that you can come back to, that you're actually going to be able to stick with. It's kind of like New Year's resolutions. You start out with great expectations, and they might sort of subside about 3 months in. And so it's going to look different for everyone, but it's a great idea to chat, like what works for you, to ask, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, what works for them, and try different things out. And if it's not meeting you where you are, drop it and try something else. And so, some big ones that come up often. Setting boundaries in the sense of like how can you protect the beginning of your day and the end of your day. And so that's a huge one. Like I won't do anything until I've had my coffee in the morning and a little bit of an Instagram scroll, and that kind of gets me going. It lets my brain say, okay, now it's time to work. And same in the evening, like if you can set a physical space to kind of move in or out of, is there an exercise class, can you close the laptop and go for a 20-minute walk? And those kinds of things start to also signal to your body a regulation where, I've sort of left this space of stress and I'm now moving into a different space of activity or processing or family time, whatever it might be. And so trying to then replicate those when you do find yourself in those periods of intense kind of stress can be really helpful as well, because your body recognizes that regulation and kind of positively responds to it and helps to reset itself. And this a good one around this, when we're talking about the news as consumers, is setting guide rails around that. So like, great, you've read your 5 politics stories. Can you go and read that one joy, wonder, and discovery? Is there like a fun photo archive picture that's come up, or a photo essay that is showing, perhaps we did some amazing work in Greenland, looking at some of the sled dogs there. That was a really fun sort of photo essay to follow as well, especially when they stole the camera. So it's finding those spaces. And this is going to sound very new agey, but be kind to yourself. And making that space that if you get it wrong one day, you're going to get it right the next day. And so not, I didn't do my Instagram and coffee this morning, the whole day is ruined, it's just going to be full of stress. Okay, like that happens sometimes. And so being able to kind of adapt as those routines need to adjust.
And Destiny, I'll come to you next. What's the one thing that helped you stay informed without being overwhelmed?
One thing. Okay. So I mean, I'll bring up the shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner this past weekend, where I found myself personally just glued to the screen for hours that night. It could have been time that I was spending with my family or, self-care, relaxing, and instead I was scrolling every social media feed that I could find. I was reading every news source. I was just unable to break away from it. And for me, it wasn't even about work, because what can I do in that situation myself? Nothing. It was something where I felt like I couldn't break away from it. I wanted more information, checking threads, checking Twitter, checking Blue Sky, just everything. And I had to step back, I think probably 3 hours in, where things were just trickling out. And I was like, okay, first of all, what would Harry say to me in this moment? And why do I feel this pressure to stay glued to it when there's nothing that I can personally do? But I had to sit down and say, I'm going to limit this just to the trusted news sources at this point, because none of this is helpful. It's not helpful to me. It's not helpful to my colleagues, friends, and journalists. There is so much misinformation out there that I was already seeing, which was also then riling me up. And so I would suggest, first of all, limiting your notifications, but ideally, you just pick one or two reputable news sources that you trust to deliver accurate, factual, and unbiased news, such as AP. And you limit your feed to those. Check those regularly, but don't make it your whole life. Don't make it your several hours of your day. It's not doing you any good. So wait for those updates. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Destiny. So what I've heard today is that there's practical things we can do, both as an organization and as individuals who consume the news to allow us to better manage the impact that the news cycle has on all of us. Supporting journalism isn't just about responding in moments of crisis, it's about creating the conditions where people can do their work safely and sustainably. I want to thank Lyndall, Destiny, and Harry for the honest and genuine, helpful conversations, and to thank everyone who tuned in today. We hope you're leaving with something useful and practical that you can take to your own lives. If you'd like to help support the people and work behind the news, please consider making a gift at apnews.com/donate or by scanning the QR code, which will be on the screen in a second. We'll see you all for day 4 tomorrow and look forward to chatting again. Thank you, everyone.